The last song. Lena had always cherished her weekends at Granny's house, a quaint, secluded cottage deep in the woods. The air there was always rich with the sense of fresh pine and Granny's lavender soap. Her grandmother was a gentle soul, with kind eyes and a warm smile that could make any worries melt away. But despite the comfort Granny brought, there was something about the old house that left Lena feeling uneasy, as if it held secrets within its walls. One crisp autumn evening, Lena's parents dropped her off for what would be her last visit. The sky was overcast, and a chill hung in the air as they drove away, leaving Lena standing on the front porch. She felt a strange sense of dread, but Granny's warm embrace quickly dispelled it. "My little Lena, you've grown so much," Granny said, her voice soft and soothing. "Come inside, let's get you warm." That night, after a cozy dinner of homemade soup and bread, Lena retired to the guest room. The bed was soft, and Granny had piled on extra blankets to keep her warm. But as Lena lay there, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, and shadows danced in the corners of the room, moving in ways that made her uneasy. In the dead of night, Lena awoke to the sound of soft humming. The melody was familiar. It was a lullaby Granny used to sing to her when she was a child. But the tune was different now, slightly out of tune, with an odd, haunting quality that sent shivers down her spine. Curiosity got the better of her, and Lena slipped out of bed, following the sound down the dark hallway. The house was cold, and every step she took seemed to echo louder than the last. The humming led her to Granny's room, where the door was slightly ajar. Peering inside, Lena saw Granny sitting in her old rocking chair, her back turned. The chair moved in a steady rhythm, and Granny's voice hummed the eerie lullaby. But something wasn't right. Granny's movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and the room was filled with a strange, oppressive air. Granny, Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. The humming stopped abruptly, and the rocking chair ceased its motion. For a moment there was complete silence. Then, slowly, Granny began to turn her head, as if it were on a rusty hinge. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as Granny's face came into view. Her eyes were vacant, glassy, and her mouth was twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Come closer, dear," Granny crooned, but her voice was wrong, too high-pitched, too forced. Lena's feet were rooted to the spot as Granny stood, her movements jerky and unnatural. The old woman's hand reached out, bony fingers extending toward Lena. "Give Granny a kiss," she whispered, her smile widening unnaturally, revealing too many teeth. Terror seized Lena, and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. She turned and bolted down the hallway, her pulse racing. Behind her, the sound of Granny's footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, echoing in the dark house. She reached the front door and yanked it open, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. But as she stepped outside, a cold, clammy hand clamped down on her shoulder, pulling her back. "Leaving so soon, dear," Granny's voice was in her ear, so close it made Lena's skin crawl. Lena spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty doorway and the dark, quiet house behind her. She ran, sprinting down the gravel path that led away from the house, not stopping until she reached the main road. When her parents found her the next morning, Lena was sitting on the roadside, trembling and clutching her knees. They rushed her home, but the memory of that night never left her. Granny's house was found empty, just as it had been for years. The townspeople said Granny had passed away long ago, but Lena never believed them. She knew what she had seen, what she had heard, the haunting lullaby, the cold touch. To this day, Lena avoids the woods, the memories of that night buried deep within her. But every now and then, in the dead of night, she swears she can still hear the faintest echo of that unsettling tune and feel the icy grip of her Granny's hand. Title: Granny's Red Yarn. Lena loved visiting her Granny's house, a small, cozy cottage nestled at the edge of a quiet forest. The house always smelled of fresh bread and lavender, and Granny would always be sitting in her favorite rocking chair, knitting something warm and comforting. Granny was the kind of woman who always had a smile on her face and a gentle word on her lips, making Lena feel safe and loved. One autumn weekend, Lena's parents dropped her off at Granny's for a visit. As usual, Granny was in her rocking chair, knitting away. But this time, something was different. The yarn Granny was using wasn't the usual soft pastel colors Lena was used to. Instead, it was a deep, dark red, almost the color of blood. "Hello, my sweet Lena," Granny said, looking up with a smile. "I'm making something special for you." Lena smiled back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "What are you knitting?" "Granny," she asked, watching the needles click together as they wove the dark red yarn into a thick fabric. "A new blanket," Granny replied, her voice soft but with a strange edge to it. "It will keep you warm and safe." Lena sat on the floor beside Granny, watching the blanket grow. The red yarn seemed to shimmer in the dim light, almost as if it were alive. Lena felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed the feeling aside. This was Granny, after all. There was nothing to be afraid of. As the evening wore on, Granny's knitting grew faster and more intense. The rhythmic clicking of the needles became louder, echoing in the small room. Lena felt herself growing sleepy, her eyelids heavy, but she couldn't look away from the blanket. Granny, Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm going to bed now." Granny didn't respond. Her hands moved faster, the needles a blur as the blanket grew longer and longer. The dark red yarn seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and Lena's unease grew into fear. Granny Lena tried again, louder this time. Granny's head snapped up, and she looked at Lena with eyes that were no longer warm and loving. They were dark, almost black, and filled with something Lena didn't recognize, something cold and malevolent. "Just a little more, dear," Granny said, her voice now low and raspy. "You'll love this blanket. It's made just for you." Lena's heart raced. She stood up, intending to leave the room, but something held her back. She looked down and saw that the blanket had somehow wrapped itself around her feet, the red yarn snaking up her legs. "Granny, stop," Lena cried, trying to pull the blanket off, but it tightened its grip, pulling her closer to the rocking chair. Granny smiled, a twisted, eerie smile. "Don't be afraid, Lena. This is for your own good." The yarn tightened further, creeping up Lena's body like a vine, wrapping around her arms and chest. Lena struggled, but the more she fought, the tighter it became. She looked into Granny's eyes, hoping to see a glimmer of the woman she loved, but all she saw was darkness. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. The only sound was the relentless clicking of Granny's needles as she continued to knit, faster and faster, until the blanket was fully wrapped around Lena, trapping her in its suffocating embrace. "Granny, please." Lena's voice was muffled by the thick, red yarn, but Granny didn't stop. She just kept knitting, her eyes locked on the blanket. Finally, Lena's vision began to fade. The last thing she saw was Granny's face, smiling down at her, but it wasn't the face of her grandmother anymore. It was something else, something ancient and terrible, wearing Granny's face like a mask. "Sleep now, my sweet girl," the creature whispered as the darkness closed in. "You're safe with me." When Lena's parents arrived the next morning, they found Granny sitting in her rocking chair, humming softly, a serene smile on her face. A beautiful red blanket was draped neatly over the chair next to her. But Lena was nowhere to be found. The police searched the house and the surrounding woods, but there was no trace of Lena. Granny simply smiled and continued knitting, a new red blanket forming in her lap. And if you visit that quiet cottage at the edge of the forest, you might hear the faint sound of knitting needles clicking together and catch a glimpse of a red blanket draped over the rocking chair, waiting for the next visitor.